when I was thinking about the sermon for today, I was reminded of a couple of things. So I just want to tell you a couple of stories at the beginning. So here's a photograph of somebody who was quite famous. Does anybody know who this is? Victor Borger. Who said that? Right. Ideal for the chase. You should be on the chase. So Victor Borger was a Danish-born comedian whose life really spanned the 20th century. He lived from 1909 to 2000. And he was a brilliant pianist. Do you remember how brilliant he was? But he was famous for never finishing anything he played. He would always stop, and he would interrupt himself. Here are some lessons. He would interrupt himself. He would get tangled up in the piano lid. Or he would turn his music sheet upside down and play something completely different. Or he would fly off the end of the piano stool. I think he must have had very good medical insurance for his act. Borger was a favourite of my father's, and we watched him on TV whenever we could. This was back in the day, you know, when the TV programs were really worth watching. And in one program, I saw Borger talking about his young life and talking about being brought up in Denmark. He spoke about being a young boy and the coldness of the winter there. He said, one day I went home from school and waited for my parents to come back to the house also. When they did, I had a huge fire roaring in the living room, which made them very angry, for we did not have a fireplace. I have never forgotten that. It was delivered so seriously. A couple of years ago, Paul and I were in California, and we were coming back from Lake Tahoe into San Francisco. And Paul saw that one lane of the freeway was completely free of traffic. So that's great, he thought. He happily coasted along it until I pointed out that there was no traffic there because there were flames along the side of the freeway, and we moved fast. Well, there were bushfires along the edge of the freeway, and nobody was taking any notice. It was unexpected for us. For Californians, just a bushfire. Well, you know, probably it was not unusual, go back please. Probably it was not unusual for fire to break out under the blazing sun on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. No surprise there for Moses the shepherd. There must have been kind of scrub fires under the heat of that sun. And yet, what a strange thing in the story. Moses stops to notice that the bush which is on fire is not burning up. And he stops and moves sideways a little bit to have a look at this. And we learn that the fire is the appearance of the angel of the Lord. But Moses cannot know that. That's something we know as we're reading the story. Curious, Moses goes forward to see what it's all about, and he hears his name. Now the Lord himself calls from the middle of the bush, calls Moses by name, and Moses answers that he's there. And so here's the question for us as we think about Moses and we maybe act this little scene out in our heads. What could we see in everyday life if we look properly? Now Max is an engineer. Max is an engineer, and I know that engineers are very good at looking at things to see how they work. And Max recently commented on a website post that he looks at theology and applies from it what is useful to him. That's the kind of action that we see in the reading today. The pausing, the looking, learning something. Sometimes if we consider a situation carefully, we feel an intensity. We feel what we could call God's presence. When that happens, there's just a difference in the moment. In the story, just where Moses is about to step is not now ordinary earth. But he's told it's holy ground. He realizes that God's there, and he behaves differently. He shields his face, he covers his own face so as not to gaze upon God. Rabbi Kushner says that this feels like a test to check whether Moses has a good concentration span. Can he pay attention? Don't know how I would go in that test, but there we go. Sometimes it requires focus to glimpse God with us. Yes, here I am, says Moses. So here's a question. Is being there enough? Because God explains that he has a plan for the rescue of the Israelites. And this is news that Moses does not want to hear because he's at the heart of it. He's going to have something to do. And he says, well, who am I to do this? He means, I'm nobody. I can't do it. He's not confident popping up to the king of Egypt, popping up to Pharaoh and saying, oh, excuse me, I've just come to lead the Israelites away. He's not confident doing that. So he's there. He's told he's about to step on holy ground. And he hears that there's a job to do, and he's not up to it. Whenever I come into this church, and it happened again today, I think of Mary Ford. From what she told me, she didn't ever particularly like preaching. Certainly not in her later years. She found preaching quite stressful. And yet I know that Mary, with her husband, had been fearless in a ministry focused on human rights and social justice. She didn't boast about this, but I know that she was famous for being brave. She stood up for what was right. They were prepared as a couple to face criticism over their views on social issues. In action, Mary made her faith matter for other people. Next slide. Oh, could we just go forward one, please, David? Well, in the reading today, God gives as a name the four-lettered word Yahweh. So it's often written in English, YHWH. And later marks for vowels were added. And that's another very confusing story, which you could read about if you wanted to. Look up the origin of the word Jehovah and see what you find out. So let's just accept that God in the text says this I am. And in the original language, it's four letters. YHWH. So God's name, if you like, is in text speak. The vowels are missing. It's Yahweh. And this is a form of a verb that means to be, to exist, to make something happen. God focuses on action relevant to need. God is saying to Moses, whatever I will be, this is what I will be. And you must tell them, the one who is that, the one who is whatever will be, the one who is, has sent me to you. And in verse 12, Moses hears that God will be with him always. I'll be with you. And when you've done this job for me, you'll worship with me. And that will be proof that I sent you. So God is asked to identify God. And doesn't give a name which is just a very tidy label. You know, imagine if you went to a conference, hello, my name is, and Cedric, say Cedric, and that's the name on the label. God is not like that. God gives as a description this verb about being what God will be. God is about possibility beyond expectation. The disciples in Matthew have to learn that following Jesus is not a walk in the park. When Jesus says that he'll suffer in Jerusalem, Peter throws a fit and denies that this can happen to Jesus. Jesus stops abruptly and calls Peter an obstacle in the way, because these thoughts of yours don't come from God, from human nature. And it's a very short, sharp lesson. Like that. Discipleship is not an activity you do on the sideline. Being there is not enough. It's unlikely to be comfortable, this being a disciple. It demands a dedication that can feel like sacrifice. Well, here I am. You know when Moses says, here I am. When we say, here I am, it must mean that we're really committing ourselves. So let's think of some examples. You know, most of us who are looking on social media are mesmerised by the flickering flames of Trump's presidency. Some of us have made an effort to understand what's really happening in America, but I don't know that I've done that very well. A whole lot of people have given themselves over to the task of studying what is going on in American society. And these people have resigned from top-level jobs, they've joined protests, they've stood up for migrants, they've gone to court. Where hatred is opposed, there the ground is holy. And so in New Zealand, finally, we've got an election campaign with some energy. And I noticed there's a handout about it today. It seems years ago that the country was alive like this. And for each of us, whatever we think politically, for each of us, the holy ground is thinking through the news to find the connection with our values. Citizens motivated by their values to cast a free vote we can't be nobodies. You know, it's not a case of, oh, why me? Like Moses, you know. When we think through, find the connections with our values and we vote, we are all counting. God will be where God will be. And God, in recent days, has extended the range of the world's compassion from that terrible destruction of tropical depression Harvey in the States in Houston to encompass the monsoon season in South Asia. People around the world are learning to care about the monsoon season, not because that's this crisis and Houston's in the past, but both of them. Suffering is suffering. How do we respond? Today's readings offer patterns for compassionate reflection and God-filled action. As we can go back to the slide with the path, please, David. Go back to the path, no, the one before. There we go. Moses is on a path with his sheep. He's deliberately keeping a low profile. If you want to read about the past of Moses, you will know why he is keeping a low profile. And he finds God there, right next to his path. And the revelation of God is connected to a job to be done by Moses. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus the revolutionary has a radical message for all who want to follow him. When he foretells being put to death and then raised to life, he is affirming life. Don't write anyone off, he's saying. Don't write me off. Don't write off the people I associate with. No one who is in captivity is to be written off. No one who presents as a nobody is to be written off. Not anyone the social systems have left behind. Not ourselves either. Life will win. That is the message that Jesus is sharing in the gospel. Now we might skip forward to the last one, and we'll have a look at the sky, we'll have a look at the sea. We will know the hymn that is coming. So the question for us is, where are we placed? Where will we place ourselves? You see, we have power to set God free into the circumstances of our living and into our relationships with other people. Receiving, responding to, becoming part of the revelation of God is how we can experience God being what God will be. Not God described in a label only some of us can read, but limitless, relating, permeating God, God in all things. To close, a few lines from a poem by Joy Cowley. Joy Cowley wrote a poem about a person who has worked cooking and setting tables for years. And she does this a bit grudgingly sometimes. She doesn't always feel like being this kind of person who cooks and gets things ready for other people. And here's how the poem ends. She prayed in gratitude, "O Holy One, I don't know how to say this, but," she's been watching the people, "but it seems that every meal is Eucharist." Watching people, she sees them together. Every meal is like communion. And God said, "Good, you're catching on." Amen.